Hello, welcome back to my channel. Now today I'm going to rank the 5 westerns that Anthony Mann made with James Stewart in the early 1950s. These 5 films for me are actually at the top of the classic western totem pole. I absolutely love them. I've watched them over and over again, and over Christmas I watched all 5 of them all over again, so they're fresh in my mind. So I want to rank them today and pay homage to them. Now when they first appeared in 1950, they were quite unusual. And they were unusual really in the way they used their leading man, James Stewart. Now, up to this point, James Stewart had been a rather sort of gawky, lollopy, leading man or supporting actor in romantic comedies, you know. And suddenly, here he was, this embittered, hard-bitten hero. It was a real transformation of an actor. It's a bit like, Liam Neeson for years was a nice character actor, wasn't he? And then suddenly he's this nasty bloke who goes around Paris shooting people in Taken. Although these are a far better series of films. A bit more believable as well. So what happened here? I remember when I was a kid, right? My dad in the 1940s, when he was a child and when he was a teenager, he'd been a real cinema goer, And whenever we watched a film, old Hollywood film on television, he knew every single actor. And he introduced them all to me. He introduced Humphrey Bogart and Gary Cooper and Robert Mitchum and Randolph Scott. He loved them all. But he didn't like James Stewart. This bothered me because I thought, and I still think to this day, that James Stewart is the single best actor Hollywood ever gave us. Him and James Mason. I think they're absolutely brilliant. So I couldn't work out why my dad didn't like James Stewart. And it took me a lot of growing up and maturing and gaining of wisdom to work it out. And the reason is this. All of those people I've mentioned, Bogart, Mitchum, Gary Cooper, John Wayne, they were men's men, weren't they? Self-reliant, tough guys, always doing the right thing. They were, as the Americans say, tall in the saddle. I like that expression. And James Stewart was not. For the vast majority of his early career, he was this light-hearted, amiable guy, a bit silly, a bit gawky, a bit camp, perhaps, a bit of a mummy's boy, not a man's man, not a hard-drinking, tough guy, And then in these westerns, he's not quite the big western hero that we're used to. He's an embittered man. He's often seeking revenge. He's often unable to contain his own emotions. He's sort of got a violent temper. He's often unlikable. He is neurotic. There's a sort of air of hysteria in his actions. Now, that's, I think, what put my dad off, right? He's not a proper man's man, But that's what I like. I find this hero that James Stewart plays much more interesting, much more complex. It's been said about these westerns that they are the most psychologically complex of the westerns. I'm a bit dubious about that. Most westerns are not psychologically complex, and actually that's part of their charm, and it's part of their strength. They're really fables. They're sort of modern Aesop's fables or myths about what it is to be a man and what it is to be civilized and the creation of the West. And Mann's films are not that much different. I mean, if you look at something like The Far Country, the morality, the psychology involved is almost childlike, but that's part of its strength, I think. But what Mann did bring to it was an extra realism. I mean, there's a sort of gritty realism, a physical realism in the use of landscape, in the use of the depiction of violence that is quite new to the Western and is very exciting and interesting in these pictures. So in these films, James Stewart plays this guy, who's always got a problem. He's always got some angst in his background, like, he's chasing his brother across America because his brother has killed their father, or someone's done him a bad turn and he wants to get revenge on them, or some woman in the past has betrayed him and it's made him sort of bitter and cynical. And they seem very similar. Actually, they're quite different. The first Western, Winchester 73, made in 1950, is what I call a grand Western. It's a statement Western. It's about the creation of the West and therefore the creation of America. So they have, there's this gun that is offered as a prize in this town shooting contest. And this gun passes through various hands through the film, and there are various episodes showing a whole panorama of the West. It's a statement Western. Bend of the River, the second Western, is a settler Western. This was a special subgenre, how people went across, the great outdoors of the West and made America, made these towns. The third Western, The Naked Spur, is what I call an exterior Western. Now that might seem a bit strange, right? Because all Westerns are about landscapes and Monument Valley. Actually, if you look at Westerns, really the main drama of Westerns is interior. It's in towns, right? Bars, saloons. It's the making of these places that made the West, right? Naked Spur is unusual. It is completely set outside. There is there's no interior at all. It's all set in exteriors, and there are only 5 actors, there are only 5 characters. It's almost like got the simplicity of a Greek, tragedy. So it's an exterior Western. When we go to the far country, even though the far country is mostly shot outside, it's actually an interior, domestic Western. It's about friendship and community and pulling together. And then the fifth Western, The Man from Laramie, it's often called Shakespearean, partly because it's it's a kind of adaptation of the Duke of Gloucester story from King Lear. You remember the Duke of Gloucester in King Lear? He has 2 sons, Edmund and Edgar. One of them is good, but is betrayed and has to go off, and he pretends to be this beggar to try to get back into his father's affections. And the other one, Edmund, is a schemer and a double dealer, and he's rising up through the ranks. And this is played out, and eventually Gloucester's tragedy, he doesn't see it till too late, and he gets blinded. And you remember Donald Crisp's character, the father figure in The Man from Laramie, is also going blind. So it's a kind of weird kind of Shakespearean drama. But it's essentially what it is. It's a dynasty Western. It's a ranching dynasty Western. Families building a ranch, father and son sort of stuff. The sort of base note of them is a greater realism. Look how dirty James Stewart's hat is. I think he wears the same hat in all of the films. It's very sweaty. He also rides the same horse. James Stewart had the same horse for 20 years. It was called Pie, and he uses the same horse in all the movies. So there's a wonderful realism. There is a psychological realism in the portrayal of the villains and the various people around Stewart's character, but it still keeps that simple fable-like structure of the Western. So let's get into the ranking. At number 5 is Bend of the River. Now, this has always been my least favourite of the Westerns, but it's still an excellent film. As I said, it's a settler Western. I don't really like settler Westerns. I don't really want to see people going along in those wagons endlessly, trying to get somewhere. Should we go over there, or should we go over there? All this sort of stuff. It kind of gets on my nerves a bit. The other reason that this one comes 5th is, for me, I don't really believe in the relationships in this film. Right? So right at the beginning, there's this scene where James Stewart saves Arthur Kennedy from a hanging for no apparent reason, really. We find out at the end that he himself was the victim of a sort of lynching, and he got away from it. But it seems to be small grounds for basing a whole friendship. This movie is about male friendship. And I just feel that the grounds for it in the first place are not really there. I don't really believe in the push and pull between James Stewart and Arthur Kennedy in this movie. I think Stewart would have seen through Kennedy a lot earlier. And then the third guy in the film is Rock Hudson, who is just put in there to look handsome. His character doesn't really have any meaning, and it's kind of like, one minute he's a sort of gambler man about town, the next minute he's a goody-goody two-shoes who's on the right side. It doesn't really work. There's an amusing apocryphal story maybe about James Stewart and Rock Hudson. Apparently, when Bend of the River was premiered, Rock Hudson got all the cheering, and all the devotion, and James Stewart was very unhappy about it and vowed he would never ever make a film with Rock Hudson again, and he didn't. So those are my main reasons why I don't like Bend of the River, but this is still a wonderful film. And the main thing to talk about here is, what a beautiful film. God, please get this film on Blu-ray or 4K if you can, or whatever, because the photography is incredible. Anthony Mann is one of the great photographers of landscape in cinema. It's not just beautiful scenery, it's the topography of the action scenes, the way that the landscape comes to mirror the psychology of what the characters are going through. So each of these films builds up to a sort of portrait of James Stewart alone in the landscape, now set on what he's going to do. And this particular film features a brilliant one. You know, he's up on a cliff with the whole landscape below him, and he's got blood on his lips, and now he suddenly realises that, you know, Arthur Kennedy is his enemy, and he's resolved to get him. It's a wonderful portrait shot, and you get one of these in every single one of these movies. What I also love about this film, the attention to detail. I said that I don't like settler westerns, and I don't really, but no other film I've ever seen so connotes just the sheer realism of how difficult it was to make the Bloody West in the first place. So the start of the film is quite an unusual setting. You know, Stewart's got to get all these cattle on a boat, right, going upriver, this paddle boat. And then the sheer difficulty of a cattle drive and getting wagons, you know, the way that Mann films it, all the different landscapes and terrain they have to go over there. Sometimes a wheel breaks or something like that, and they have to fix the axle, and men have to heave up the wagon. Where they're going to get the food from, where the supply is going to come from, how you're going to pay for the supplies, what's the banking system in place to make sure that those supplies get to you. That's what this film is about. You know, these guys have set up, these settlers have set up in this far-off land, but then a gold mine sets up, and it ruins all their supply chain. Just the simple, gritty reality of that is something that Bend of the River really brings home. And I think that's the great success of the film. Now, in fourth place is The Far Country, often a much neglected and overlooked film. Oh, I love this film. But The Far Country kind of picks up where Bend of the River leaves off. It's also about, you know, James Stewart is on a cattle drive. He's bringing cows to this town, then he's trying to get them on board this paddle steamer, again going up river towards Alaska. You know, it's the same kind of thing. But this Western has got a different intent. It's really about who James Stewart is. And we start off the movie, and it seems like he's a murderer. And he's killed two guys on this cattle drive. And the police come after him, and he gets away with it by luck, really. You know, he's on this paddle steamer. The paddle steamer's already set off. The guys on the paddle steamer try to lock him up, but a mysterious woman comes to his aid. And throughout the first half of the movie, really, James Stewart is a man on the run, and he keeps meeting nice people, but he's not really very nice to them back. So it's a curious movie about how this kind of really embittered person is assimilated into a group of people. I love this film. I would admit that it's probably not as great as the three films I'm going to discuss afterwards. But you know how in life, right, there's these movies that always get the top of the polls, don't they? Citizen Kane and Vertigo and La Règle du Jeu. And they're all brilliant. But there are some movies in your life you come across. Every time they're on TV, you watch them. There's something about them. They're not particularly the best films ever made, but you just love them. You kind of live inside them. They're like special friends, like a special overcoat you wear when it's cold. The Far Country is that to me. I absolutely love this film. I adore it. I love every single one of the characters. You know, it's got Walter Brennan in it. I mean, come on. Walter Brennan. I can't even do a Walter Brennan impression. I'm not even going to try, but I love Walter Brennan. And he's constantly talking about coffee all the way through the film. I love Corinne Calvet as the French girl with her little pom-pom hat. She's great. I love John McIntyre as the villain. I love John McIntyre, just full stop. But he's so brilliant as the villain Gannon in this film. And he's relishing every line and every sort of interaction with James Stewart. I live in the two towns, Skagway and Dawson, and I love the people. I love the fact that Anthony Mann takes time for a little sequence in the hash house in Dawson, where these three older ladies do a song and dance on the old piano. Love that scene. And I love the people in the film. I think you could argue that it's not as strong a film as the three films I'm going to talk about now, but in terms of my affection for it, I love it to pieces. I absolutely adore it. The third film for me is The Man from Laramie, which apparently was James Stewart's personal favourite amongst his films. This is a great film. I've already talked about its sort of Shakespearean stylings. It's a wonderful family drama with an excellent performance from Donald Crisp as the sort of paterfamilias, who's got this sort of wayward son. He's a wicked lad, he's a wicked lad. And then he's got this sort of adoptive son of Arthur Kennedy, but little does he realise that Arthur Kennedy is the real sort of, thorn in his side. And it's going to be a new adoptive son, James Stewart, who will come and take over his ranch, his legacy. This is a wonderfully written film, written by Philip Yordan. Three of the first five films were written by Borden Chase, and his sensibility is very much a part of these films. But this one is written by Philip Yordan, excellent writer, and it's a very, very well scripted drama. One thing that must be talked about here is the scenes of violence in this movie, which I think are more powerful than in the previous four films, and are leading up to Mann's masterpiece, Man of the West with Gary Cooper, which is also very Shakespearean and takes a lot of its lead from this movie. There's a moment of violence in this film which I think is extraordinary. So what we've seen is Donald Crisp's rather wayward son burns James Stewart's wagons on these huge salt flats at the start of the movie. Very well directed sequence, very visually powerful sequence. Later on, at the salt flats, he corners James Stewart, and in front of his men, and it's so brilliantly staged, he shoots James Stewart in the hand. And you don't see it, and all you can hear off camera is James Stewart whining. He doesn't scream, he doesn't shout, he whines pitifully, like a little girl almost. And you see that the men who are, all work for this wayward son lower their heads in shame. It's one of the most powerful sequences of violence in movies that, it doesn't have to be, lots of people shooting and dying. It's just one man performing an act, a shameful act on another. And the power of it really comes through. And this is where Mann I think really shows his chops as a director. And eventually, the men who work for the wayward son put James Stewart on his horse and let him go away. An incredibly powerful sequence. Second place in my list is Winchester 73. This is one of the great westerns, all done in this dangerous, lowering black and white cinematography. Oh God, the cinematography is incredible. And this is where James Stewart first brings to life this new character he's playing. I love portmanteau films, different episodes making up a whole movie, and this is a brilliant example of it. I love all of the episodes that make up this story of this gun travelling from hand to hand through the American West, as, Stewart is simultaneously tracking down the right to hold the gun, and therefore be the person who sort of brings his law and his philosophy to the West, but also tracking down his evil brother who killed their father. And I love each episode. I love the shootout at the beginning, which is brilliantly staged, the shooting contest. But then comes my favourite bit of the movie. The brother gets away with the gun, and they go to this little trading post, and there's John McIntyre again. Watch the way that Mann directs this sequence. He has McIntyre right in the foreground, and he's just playing like solitaire with himself, with a little cheroot coming out of his mouth. And all the way through, McIntyre just talks like that. Interesting gun you got there. Or, it's this really wonderful, low delivery with the men in sort of deep focus on the bar. That scene, honestly, that's one of my favourite scenes in movies. I just love it so much, and I love McIntyre's performance. Then Dan Duryea turns up, and of course he's bonkers, because Dan Duryea is always bonkers. And he has a scene with Shelley Winters in this kind of cabin, which is rather fun. It's interesting to see Shelley Winters at the early stages of her career. But all through the movie, I think Mann's direction, is peerless in this film. It's a very sharp film, it's a very angry film, a much grittier portrait of the start of the West and what it took to make the West than you'd find in Ford or Hawks. And I love it. I really value it. But it's not my favourite. My favourite is The Naked Spur. Now, why do I love The Naked Spur so much? Well, first of all, let's talk about the fact, what I called it, an exterior film. This is a Western that completely is set outside, and my God, the scenery is beautiful and brilliantly used. The way that Mann has thought through the way each location works with the scene and the action in it. So it's all set outside, and this gives it a very powerful, elemental feel. It's man in nature, dwarfed by nature. So it gives it, as I said, this kind of Greek tragic feel. And we've only got 5 characters in the whole film, and what a brilliant cast. James Stewart, Millard Mitchell, Janet Leigh, Robert Ryan, who spends the whole movie laughing. I can't do a Robert Ryan impression, so I'm not going to bother. And there's also Ralph Meeker, who plays the rather thankless role of the young, feckless cavalry officer who's been discharged dishonourably. But actually, he plays it really well and doesn't let the rest of the cast down. It's a really tight cast. And what you're watching is this kind of poker game between the 5 of them, all moving around each other. And it's kind of fascinating to watch. I like that when you've got a small group of people and you're watching the psychology between them. What I also really like about this film, though, and why it's my personal favourite, is because that hysteria, that angst, that neurotic nature of the James Stewart character is here at its most powerful. I think one of the reasons why Bend of the River is my least favourite of the films is because that's where it's least in evidence and where James Stewart is his most simplistically heroic. And so the film loses because of that. But in this film, Stewart is really screwed up. Right from the beginning of the movie, first of all, he gets poor old Millard Mitchell involved in his schemes. He's endangering everyone. And people get killed. I mean, like, at one point, they're attacked by this Indian group of Native Americans. And they don't have any speaking roles, these poor people. And they're chasing this dissolute cavalry officer. And the cavalry officer tricks James Stewart and the people he's with. And so they have to defend themselves. And they end up killing all of them. All of these Native Americans are killed. They're just decimated. And Mann directs this very well, right? Stewart is going off camera and he looks round at them and he just hangs his head in shame. So what seems in the script a rather horrible loss of life is just quickly denoted to the audience. But also what's happening there is that Stewart is, of course, responsible. Everything bad that happens, Millard Mitchell's death, Ralph Meeker's death, it's really because of Stewart's actions, because of this insatiable desire to get this guy back, to claim the bounty for him. And all the way through the film, Stewart is rather unsympathetic, and he's also weak, right? We're not used to a Western hero being weak. That's a very different thing, going back to what my dad thought about Robert Mitchum and John Wayne. You don't see that, but here you see it. There's even a scene where he gets shot, and he's delirious in his dreams, and he's calling out to his wife, who we find out rejected him for another man and took away his money. You couldn't get a weaker man. He's embarrassed, he's exposed in front of these people he's with, but also in front of us. And this builds and builds to a climax, right, where in his madness, he's dragging the body of Robert Ryan through the water to get him on land. He's almost insane by this point, and Janet Leigh is trying to talk reason into him. For God's sake, I'll go with you. I'll do whatever you want. And it builds this kind of fever pitch, and where Stewart is finally having to confront who he is and what he's doing. I remember watching this film again at Christmas. I was with my mum. It was Christmas time, and she found that a bit silly. She was like, "Oh God." I find it every time I watch it incredibly moving. It gets to me every time. I'm like got a lump in my throat. And that moment when he finally breaks, he finally realises what he's doing and just stops. And he and Janet Leigh finally come together. I find incredibly moving. I saw someone online saying that ending was a bad ending to a good movie. No. To me, it's one of the most powerful endings in American film. It's so moving. Because it's what the film is about. It's not about the last shootout with Robert Ryan. That's not the climax of the film. The climax of the film is finally this intense psychological neurotic journey that Stewart is going through. Finally reaches its climax and boom, he breaks. But he breaks into being someone who's good. He breaks into being the best of himself. And that's why I love this movie so much. I love these movies. I hope you do too. I'd love you to share your own ranking below and your own thoughts on them. And watch out very soon for a ranking of Randolph Scott and Bud Bettiker's Renown Cycle. Thanks very much.